We have the scary front row, the safe zone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Kim Higgins, I'm the event manager, and I've been looking forward to introducing Kerrin Willis. Her book, Iron and Fire, we brought it in as a consignment book, and it flies off the shelf like no other consignment book we have had, so we're very happy to host her here this evening. Kerrin is going to talk about her novel, Iron and Fire, that takes place in Plymouth Colony in 1675, set against the backdrop of King Philip's War. Her main character, Verity, is an independent, intelligent woman living at a time when those qualities were of no value, to put it lightly. One of the things I love the most about living in New England is the history, all the lives that have been lived, and especially we hear a lot about it in this building here, all the people who remember Falls Market and the history of it, so it does definitely have a really good feeling. Kerrin describes herself as a writer of historical fiction, historical romance, and badass historical women. I just love that. You know, we need to be friends. She lives in Taunton, Massachusetts with her 2 daughters. She's a high school English teacher who prides herself on being a feminist and a strong protagonist in her own story, and she would probably have been burned as a witch in colonial New England. Wouldn't we all? I kind of think, you know. Kerrin can be usually found pausing The Little Mermaid and subjecting her daughters to a lecture on the dangers of giving up their voice. Kerrin has a BA in English from Stonehill College, an MA in English from Simmons College, and is currently working on her MFA in fiction from Southern New Hampshire University. So, without further ado, everyone please give a warm welcome to Kerrin Willis.
See, that's nice. Usually when I talk about books in a classroom, I don't get applause. Although that can change. All right, so this is me. I am Kerrin Willis. I have lived in southeastern Massachusetts for, it's like 99% of my life. I didn't like to do the math. I lived in California for 2 years. But something about New England just drew me back. I'm a mom, I'm a teacher, I'm a complete book nerd, and I am a pretty vocal feminist. I put this quote up here: reading gives us somewhere to go when we have to stay where we are. I love to read. I have loved to read my entire life. I spent a lot of my childhood grounded. Thanks, Mom. Every time I got a B on my report card, I was grounded until the next report card came out. So if I got a B in June, I was grounded until November. My mom doesn't mess around. Which just meant that I couldn't watch TV. And so if I couldn't watch TV, my dad would take me to the Brown Bookstore on Saturdays, and he started telling me I could have as many books as I could carry. Then he realized that was a big mistake. And he started taking me to the library instead because it was a lot cheaper. But I love books. My kids are sick of my shoving books in their face and trying to come up with something they might want to read. This is my family. Notice anything about it? Yeah, we don't have boys in my family. There hasn't been a boy born in my family since 1945. There's a lot of female energy. At holidays, there's just my 80-year-old uncle sitting at the head table with all of us around him. And now he can turn down his hearing aids on his cell phone. So it's great. So I can say, coming from a family of women, we get things done. We don't really believe in sitting around. If something needs to get done, we get it done. So I started wondering, where are all the stories of the women in history? In history class, who do you learn about? You learn about the people who were in government, you learn about the people who were in the military, and they were largely men. But we've always been here. Women have always been here. We've always been strong, we've always been smart, we've always been opinionated. It's just that hasn't always been a good thing. So most people don't know too much about the 1600s. It's not really a period that we study a lot in school. A lot happened. Every time I would look to research something or try to find out why my character might have a motivation or feelings about something, I was able to find something in British history that just fit perfectly. 1603, Queen Elizabeth I, guys. Queen Elizabeth I was kind of a big deal. You may have heard of her. In 1605, you got the Gunpowder Plot. There was a Catholic man who did not like the fact that England was a Protestant country, and he prepared to blow it up. And they still celebrate it every November. With bonfires, it's very exciting. In 1624, George Fox was born. George Fox was the man who started the Society of Friends, which we in the US know as the Quakers. The English Civil War began in 1642. Charles I was the first British monarch to have his, and only British monarch, to have his head cut off. In 1649, my main character, Verity Parker, was born in 1656 in the middle of all of this. And I think that sounds terrible, and then I realized that my kids were born in 2013 and 2016, and they haven't had the best time since then, so. 1661, the monarchy was brought back in. Charles II was crowned king. 1665, the plague sweeps through London and kills almost a third of the population. And then in 1666, we had the Great Fire of London, and the entire city burned to the ground. I don't know about you, but if I was alive for most of that, I think it would have an impact on my life. A little bit. All right, so New England history. In school, we learned that in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived. My daughter came home from kindergarten this year telling me a lovely story about how the Native Americans and the English planted corn together, and they all held hands and had a big party. And do I ruin her life and tell her what actually happened? Or then there's a big knowledge gap, and we don't learn too much until the Salem witch trials in 1692. So you've got Thanksgiving dinner, and then 70 years later, several girls hallucinate on bread mold and get a bunch of people killed. We don't learn about anything that happened in the middle. I don't know about you, but I did. What actually did happen? In the 1610s, right before the Pilgrims showed up, disease swept through the Native American village of Patuxent, which is where the Pilgrims settled and called Plymouth. So the land was cleared. There was already space for houses. There was space for them to plant conveniently. In 1620, as we know, the Pilgrims arrived. 1621, they had the first Thanksgiving, which they wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for, we all learned about Squanto in elementary school, and the Pokanoket chief, Massasoit, who showed the English how to plan, how to survive. In 1630, Boston was settled in Massachusetts Bay by slightly different Puritans from England. Harvard was founded in 1636. So before they did pretty much anything else, they built Harvard. My hometown, Taunton, was founded in 1637. And in case anyone was curious, Plainville was founded in 1661. Also in 1661, the chief Massasoit dies. Massasoit was the guy who wanted to form a good relationship with the English. Or he was enough of a good leader and a good diplomat to know it was best for his people if they could form a good relationship. But when he died, his son became king, or became sachem. And then the next year, his son died very mysteriously. He was invited to the governor of Plymouth's house and died on the way home. His people thought that was a little strange. And his brother, Metacom, who is also known as King Philip, became the sachem. Metacom was not as interested in forming a nice, happy relationship with the colonists. That he blamed them for his brother's death. He blamed them rightfully, for a lot of things that they had done. In 1670, the Taunton Iron Works, which was the first ironworks in Plymouth Colony, was established. It was only the second in the New World. In 1671, the colonists told Metacom he needed to come to what is now Church Green in Taunton, and he needed to deliver all of his weapons and sign a peace treaty and swear he would never attack the English. He didn't. And in 1675, a Native American man named John Sassamone was discovered dead under the ice in Assawampset Pond in Lakeville with a head wound. turns out his death was a little sketchy. What followed was Metacom's War, which is the bloodiest war per capita in American history. I never learned about it in school. I don't know about you, but it seems like the bloodiest war per capita in American history is kind of a big deal, especially when it happened here. 2,500 colonists died, which was a third of the population, and at least 5,000 indigenous peoples died, but we don't know what the original number was. It was the deadliest war per capita, and most people don't even know about it.
Kevin,
Yes.
where was that picture from?
That is a memorial in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, from a massacre at the end of the war. So, some things about the Native Americans that I also did not learn in school. We use terms like Algonquin to talk about any tribes that spoke an Algonquin language. We talk about the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag were an Algonquin tribe. Allied tribes like the Pokanoket, the Pecasset, and the Sakonnet were Wampanoag tribes who spoke Algonquin languages. So all of these words seem to be used interchangeably, but they don't all mean the same thing. Unlike the King of England, the Native American sachems did not wield power over their subjects. They were caretakers for their people. So they could be deposed, they could be disagreed with. And these settlers growing up under the British monarchy had no concept of this. They didn't bother to learn. The most powerful sachem in New England at the time was a woman. Her name was Weedamoo. Imagine 17th century British men coming up against the most powerful woman in New England. They just kind of turned the other way because they didn't want to deal with her. They refused to understand that the systems of government were different than theirs were. Women did not cede property to their husbands when they got married, which means that when Weedamoo got married, she still stayed the most powerful sachem in New England. Her husband was just her husband. He didn't get her job. The colonists would try to bargain with him, deal with him, get him drunk and get him to sign over deeds. All illegal. The land didn't need to be tamed in the Native American idea. They didn't build permanent houses. They didn't build fences. And the English didn't understand this. And they also couldn't sell land because they personally didn't own it. This lovely gentleman, Sassamone, I was talking about, he was found dead under the ice at Assawampset Pond in January of 1675. 3 Wampanoag men were tried for his murder by the English court in Plymouth. How would you feel if Canada suddenly came down and did not bring their free healthcare and started trying Americans for crimes? I wouldn't be too happy about it. Maybe Canada is a bad example. I might be happy about that. But if another country came in, I probably wouldn't be. And so this just raised more tensions between the colonists and the Native Americans. The war was fought all over New England. It went all the way up to Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Pretty much all of New England was involved. It was eventually won by the colonists in that the Native Americans did surrender. I don't know if you can say anyone really wins. Metacom was beheaded. Supposedly his head was in someone's basement in Plymouth until the 1920s. Not confirmed, but kind of a good story. Weedamoo was drowned in the Taunton River and her body was displayed on Taunton Green. And that's what led to me looking into this and writing the book, because the most powerful woman in New England was murdered and displayed on the green 2 miles away from my house. I was interested. Nearly all the Native Americans were either killed in the war, or if they were found, they were sold to slavery in the Caribbean. So it was the first genocide in North America. Which brings me to my lovely characters. Verity Parker was born in 1656 in London to Charles and Anne Parker, and she was raised in a flat above her father's bookshop. She's the second of 7 children, and only 2 survived. Everyone else was killed. Think that would have a big impact on you? Yeah. She was her father's favorite. Since he didn't have any living sons, he would bring her down to his bookshop. He taught her to read. He taught her to keep the accounts. He taught her how to argue with him so he could discuss books with her. So she had as good an education as anyone in London. She attended secret Quaker meetings with her dad. What do you guys know about Quakers? Anything? Kellen? Yep.
I am one.
Okay. Want to give you some facts?
Just back from a yearly meeting of 300 people that met in Vermont, but
Wow.
they're Quakers, and the meeting in Providence, and a couple of meetings Quakers are very much alive,
Mhm.
now, but,
And-
and we're very, very much there were a lot of Quakers, more Quakers in the population than there are now.
I believe
I have here.
The Puritans did not like that. The Quakers believed that no one person was spiritually superior to another, which meant that women were not less than men, which meant that people in the church, well, they really didn't have a church hierarchy, but people in the church hierarchy were not worth more than the average citizen. Puritans did not like that. In fact, they killed several Quakers. In Massachusetts, they made it a crime to be a Quaker in Massachusetts. She lost her father to fever, and there was only her mother, herself, and her older sister. And then they sailed for Plymouth in 1674, her mother to marry a widower in Plymouth Colony, sight unseen. Settles in Taunton with her mother, her sister, her stepfather, and 5 siblings. So I just want you to imagine that you are 19 years old. You have a pretty solid education. You've been taught to think for yourself. You've been taught to argue. And suddenly, you find yourself in Puritan New England, where women were expected to just keep their mouths shut, cook the food, bring in the crops, have the babies. That's about it. Would you have a hard time keeping your mouth shut? Good. Okay. All right, let's see if I work cited because I'm a good English teacher and I always have to have work cited. I'm just going to read you a quick section of the book. All right. June 3rd, 1675. Afternoons to herself were few and far between, and Verity resolved to take full advantage of this one. Mother hadn't needed her at the house for once and had suggested that Verity go for a walk, which she was all too happy to do. Pausing long enough to remove her shoes and stockings, she weaved along through the trees, relishing the cool, spongy feel of the grass on the soles of her feet. The melodic sound of running water grew louder, and Verity climbed onto a large, flat rock and gazed down at the source, an energetic river cutting through the forest and spanning roughly 10 feet across. Glittering silver and greenish blue fish darted to and fro in the water, and a large river bird sat motionless on an overhanging branch, patiently waiting for his chance to snatch his supper. She sat on the rock, rucking up her skirts to feel the sun-warmed granite on the backs of her knees, and scooted to the edge of the rock to dangle her toes in the icy river. The water was frigid, slicing through her feet like a knife and sending an eruption of goose flesh up to her knees. She inhaled sharply through her teeth for a moment, until finally her skin began to acclimate to the water and her feet went pleasantly numb. Lying back on the rock, she removed her cap as well, unbinding her hair and letting it cool under her head on the warm granite. Verity was deep in daydreams when a sharp inhalation of breath behind her made her start. She snapped around, yanking her feet out of the water and grabbing for her cap. Christopher Harwell was standing within arm's reach of her, the look of surprise on his face slowly giving way to sheepish embarrassment. He tucked a loose strand of jet black hair behind his ear before extending a hand to Verity to help her up. "My apologies, mistress." His voice was surprisingly deep, and the sound of it was jarring in comparison to the melodic cacophony of the spring day. "Nope, I was just leaving," Verity stuttered, ignoring his proffered hand as she hastily put her cap over her disheveled hair and climbed to her feet. "Please, mistress, you needn't leave on my account." He smiled, and Verity noticed that one side of his mouth rose higher than the other. She refused to admit to herself that it was charming. Verity could just imagine what her stepfather would say about her being barefoot and bareheaded, alone in the woods, with an ironworker who had just spent time in the pillory for not attending church. "I never had the chance to thank you for the food," Harwell said, hopping onto the rock where Verity had just been lying. She took an involuntary step backwards, nearly toppling into the river, but managing to right herself at the last minute. "Careful there," he said with a grin. "The river's rocky and cold as ice." Verity nodded, shaken by his presence and her near fall. She observed that he wore a shirt of plain homespun, breeches, and neither shoes nor stockings. His black hair was tied back with a leather thong, and the scruff of a beard that had graced his face when she last saw him marked him as someone who did not follow the traditional rules. Puritan men were clean-shaven. She could smell him, a mixture of wood smoke, and hot metal, and something underneath that she couldn't place. "It was nothing," Verity replied when she finally found her voice. She began hastily stuffing her hair underneath her cap while he watched. "It was the duty of a Christian neighbor. Your friend seemed grateful." The last was said with a slight grimace she couldn't quite manage to repress as she looked around for her shoes and stockings. James means no harm." Harwell was squinting to look at her now, the sun in his eyes. "Although I suspect he may actually have been raised by beasts. He knows nothing of how to speak to girls of good family." "And a convicted criminal such as yourself has made a careful study of it, I suppose?" Verity regretted the retort as soon as the words were out of her mouth. Why could she never seem to speak without causing trouble or giving offense? Goodman Harwell, however, didn't seem bothered by the comment. "Only when I see one who interests me." Harwell's smile had the conflicting effect of charming Verity while simultaneously making her want to slap it off his face. It was as if he knew something about her that she herself did not, and whatever it was amused him. She resisted the inclination to demand of him what it was that he found so humorous. Instead, she concentrated on locating her shoes and stockings. Once she found them tucked behind the rock, she sat down to put them on. Harwell turned his back to offer her privacy. "Mistress?" "Yes." "Would you tell me your name?" She tied the garters just under her knees and stood, brushing the dirt from her skirts. "Verity Parker," she replied, almost daring him to find something amusing in that. "Verity Parker," he replied, turning around to face her again. Her name sounded somehow different coming from him, personal. She wanted to snatch it back. His eyes turned curious. "Can I ask you, Verity Parker, what it was that made you and your sister so concerned for our welfare that night? You brought food and drink to two men you had never met, men who had broken the law. I've been turning it over in my head for weeks." "It was the Christian thing to do?" "Perhaps so," one side of his lips raised in that infuriatingly handsome half-smile again. "But I find those who talk about Christian duty are often the last to put it into practice." Verity had the same thought many times, but uttering so out loud to a total stranger seemed dangerous to say the least. "You forget yourself, Goodman Harwell." "Kit, please." "Perhaps, were you to attend church on Sunday, you would gain a deeper understanding of the Christians among whom you live." How Hannah would laugh if she could hear her sister lecturing anyone on the importance of attending a Puritan church. "Perhaps so, Verity Parker. But where is it written that Christian goodness can only be experienced in a church?" Verity closed her eyes and thought of the forests surrounding them, the trees that formed a vaulted ceiling overhead, the musical burbling of the river, the warmth of the sun on the rocks. If that wasn't holy, what was? "Were you not raised with a church, Goodman Harwell?" Verity opened her eyes and met his directly. "I was, but I was also raised to use my mind. I don't believe that God has given us a reason to ignore it. Man can reason and ask questions so that he might know himself more fully." "And what of women?" Verity recalled moments from years past, sitting among friends with her father, listening to women share their revelations about God. The Quaker recognition of women as the equal to men, a sentiment that had been embraced and honored by her father, was perhaps the one thing Verity missed the most about her former life. And that's it. All right, so I think we're going to do a Q&A.
So I will come around with a microphone. Can hear your question.
Oh, see, because I recognize I'm standing up here, I'm talking about a book, and everyone's just staring at me. I didn't think I had to do that for another couple weeks.
I'll start it off a little. Did you read the Winthrop Woman? It's about Elizabeth Winthrop who came.
I did not.
That's a good one with a lot of history in it.
I will check it out.
And it brought me to, not because I knew it, but looking up my ancestry. And yes, what my great-great-great-grandfather was banished to Rhode Island as a Quaker.
Very nice.
And his son lived in Taunton and was one of the, started up one of the ironworks.
That's so cool. That's fascinating.
And I never knew this from my family.
Very nice. I like it. Yeah, Rhode Island, the history of Rhode Island is fascinating. They were like the crazy liberals in New England. How did you come up with the name Verity? How did I come up with the name Verity? I had a friend who lived in California whose name was Verity. And the the Puritans had a habit of naming their children after virtues. And they had some pretty terrible ones. I mean, they had children named Thankful. They had children named Chastity. They had children named like closes his eyes at the sight of God. That's a first name. Verity is a virtue that means truth, and so it seemed to fit very well with her. Verity also popped into my head pretty much fully formed, and I didn't have much say in who she was. She just sort of told me I was going to sit down and write this book, which makes me sound crazy. I'm not.
How much research did you do into Quakers, and what form did that research take?
A lot of reading. I took out a lot of books from the library about the history of Quakers in New England, the Quaker martyrs who were killed in Boston. I traveled to the Quaker Meeting House in Newport, which was super fun. Just a lot of reading, basically. When I discovered that the Quaker movement was really getting going around the same time as the novel was set, that made a lot of sense to me as to why Verity would have these very liberal ideas for her time.
Hello.
Hi.
So, Miss Willis, I know you're a mom, and I know you're a teacher, and I know you were in school getting a master's degree. How did you have time to write this?
For real?
I don't remember. I write whenever I have time, like whenever I have 5 minutes. I have a great web-based app that I use, so I can write on any laptop, any iPad. I can write on my phone while my kids are in gymnastics or in, well, I'm in the waiting room while my daughter's in OT. So I write little bits at a time. I kind of had to train myself. You can't wait for inspiration. If you have 5 minutes, you use 5 minutes. So in line at the grocery store.
How long did it take you to write it?
It took about 2.5 years. My second book only took about 6 months. This one took so long because we had a family tragedy, and I don't know, family tragedies, death on top of COVID. I was kind of paralyzed for about a year and I couldn't write anything. But then it became kind of an escape. So yeah, overall it took about 2.5 years, and I learned a lot in that time.
You mentioned your second book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. My second book is coming out in March. It is called Strange Arithmetic, and it is a dual timeline novel that takes place about 60% in 1944, the second largest military embarkation camp on the eastern seaboard during World War II was located in what is now the Miles Standish Industrial Park in Taunton. And so there was a ton of good stories there. I say we, I wasn't here. But they housed Italian prisoners of war who, once Italy surrendered, were no longer prisoners of war, but they were in this gray area where they couldn't quite be sent home. So they were sent to work at the camp. And they also housed German POWs. And of course, if you've got POWs and the United States Army, plus a lively city of tens of thousands of civilians, you're gonna have people running into one another. So that's what that one's about. It's currently in the second stages of editing right now.
In researching the Native American cultures for this book, did you find that there was sort of a dearth of primary source material, or are there good information being drawn by some of the organizations?
I mean, there is a primary source material based largely in the fact that the culture at the time was largely passed down through oral tradition. So things weren't written down, whereas the Puritans, being Protestants who had just gotten their hands on the Bible in English, were fascinated with the written word. So they wrote down everything. But yeah, there aren't a lot of primary sources to deal with. There are a few. There are a lot of really good historians now that are working on it. But I, a lot of times, had to use the English sources and get what I could from that.
When you're writing the book, when you're writing dialogue, how do you figure out how people used to talk in the 1600s?
I don't know. I mostly hear them in my head and I write down what they say. The most complicated part was swearing, because they didn't swear the same way we do. And some of my favorite words hadn't been invented yet. So my editor would respond, "Oh, they didn't know that one, sweetheart." So luckily, I took several classes on medieval literature and Chaucer in college, and learned that they used to swear by swearing on different body parts of Jesus. So they would say like Christ's legs, or Christ's bones, or Christ's earlobes. That was how they swore. So that's in the book. I took some liberties with some characters one in particular who just needed to be vulgar. But largely I just sort of hear them in my head, and then I have to go back and double check and make sure the words and expressions that they used would have existed.
I remember you spent a class complaining about that.
I did. I had that book on the history of swearing on my desk, and I wouldn't let anyone read.
She got a student to do that.
Did you always want to write? Did you know you were going to grow up and write books, or did you come?
I've always written. I just love stories, and when I was younger, I didn't want the stories to end. When they did, you know when a really good book ends and you miss the characters? So I wrote some Hannah Green Gables fan fiction. It's good stuff. So I've always just been writing little things. This is the first one that just took off, and I know it sounds crazy, but Verity Parker camped herself out in my head and would not leave until I had written down her story. And the only way I could get her to stop talking to me at inappropriate times, like when I was teaching, or I'm in the shower, or whatever, was to write down what she wanted me to say. You don't need a microphone, Mary, what's up?
Do you get those, I'm louder than the microphone. Do you get those feelings often when you're writing about other things, or was it just with her?
Yes, she's probably the most forceful, but usually I hear or I see something that just kind of strikes an idea, and the character develops from there, and it is much easier if they're willing to talk to me. And I don't have to drag a story out of them. Mary, what were you gonna say?
So can you talk a little bit about how the editing and publishing process was different from the first book and the second? I know you talked about sort of the difference in time. Can you elaborate on that?
I just learned a lot with the first one that I would, like, mistakes that I wouldn't make again. I started my MFA, my master's in fine arts in fiction writing about 2 years ago. And a lot of the classes that I've taken have been on publishing and editing and marketing, which was not fun. And it just sort of made the path a lot clearer for me. So the first time I was doing this, I had to research everything. Whereas the second time, I'd already done it. So I just had to copy what I did last time. Anyone else?
How hard was it to come up with a title? Did you have that right away, or did you had to work on it?
That one I had to work on. I tried out about 15 different titles that I did not like. And this one just sort of came to me and it worked because the two main characters, the Verity is fire, there's no question. She refers to herself as being fiery. Her stepfather is constantly telling her she's going to burn in hell. She's just that incendiary personality. And Kit he works in the ironworks, but he's quiet. He thinks things through before he speaks. He's solid. And so once it popped into my head, it kind of worked. Same thing happened with the second book, Strange Arithmetic. I had no idea what I was going to call it. And then I was reading a Wilfred Owen poem to teach. And yay, Wilfred Owen! And he talks about the strange arithmetic of the universe and the fact that we're only in a certain place at a certain time because all of these other things had to add up. And I just thought that was cool. So I stole it, and he's dead, so he can't argue with me.
Hi. Hi. What advice would you like to give? What advice would you give someone who wants to start writing historical fiction?
Read everything you can get your hands on and just write. It doesn't matter if it's good. It doesn't matter if you think, you'll never think it's good. But just get the words on the page. Keep plugging away. You don't know that. It's what I tell you all the time. Anyone else?
How many of your students are there?
Current and former, oh God, 1, 2,
How cool is that?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15-ish.
That's awesome.
They're pretty great, I like them. In fact, I dedicated the book to these 3 and one in the back.
Because they sat in my classroom every morning at 7 o'clock and I felt guilty if I wasn't there writing with them, so. Whatever works.
So the question I have just kind of goes off of a comment that you made earlier about like your daughter coming home from kindergarten and talking about like this fairy tale of like the Pilgrims and the Native Americans coming together to share a meal. How did it feel to be working with kind of such a like fraught and undertold story that really is complicated?
I want to do it justice, so that was complicated. Several people have asked me why there isn't a Native American character in the story, and it's because I didn't feel like I had any business trying to write a Native American character. I feel like there are plenty of Indigenous authors who would be fantastic at that. And I also looked into getting a sensitivity reader from the Wampanoag tribe, and I didn't really have any success with that. But I spent a lot of time wanting to do the story justice, not wanting to paint it as English bad, Indian good, because it's too simple. The theme of the story really is that all people have the capacity to be terrible, and that all people have the capacity to be good. There are good people on both sides. There are bad people on both sides. It happened that there were more bad people with better weaponry on the English side. But yeah, it was complicated trying to figure out, especially language. I mean, words that would have been considered perfectly fine for someone to say in 1675 were not perfectly okay for me to write in 2021. So trying to strike that balance and maintain some sensitivity while also showing the brutality of the world was complicated. Did you have one? Did you write your hand up?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you
you know, or was one of the sachems buried somewhere in Cape Cod? Because my husband and I saw one off one of the main roads and we followed through the woods and there's a monument there. I want to say maybe Massasoit, but I'm not sure.
Possible. Massasoit died on the road from Bristol, Rhode Island, what is now Bristol, Rhode Island, back up to Taunton. So I don't know where he was buried. Metacom, his body was disposed of, and his head was supposedly kept in Plymouth. Weedamoo was left out for everyone to see. We did not make it into the book because my editor said it was too disturbing, which was depressing. It just so happens my best friend is a medical examiner for the state of Massachusetts, so she's very handy when you can text her and ask about the state of decomp a body would be in after several weeks. And then she says, "Is this for work or pleasure?" How long would it take someone to bleed out of a uterine hemorrhage? And she would say, "Personal or professional?" Because if it's personal, don't text me. So I'm not exactly sure, but there were so many different tribes in the area, and they were all intermarried with each other, and they had this very tight kinship system. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Kerrin, I was curious about your cover art. Sometimes when I go to the library, I don't have something in mind. I'm walking around and a cover catches my eye. So what made you choose that cover art?
Well, everyone does judge a book by its cover, even though we're told not to. I worked with a fantastic designer in Toronto, and I told her sort of what I wanted. I wanted to incorporate New England foliage. I wanted Verity herself to be here, and she's very, very tiny on the bottom. You can kind of see her back walking into the woods. But that was all I knew. And the designer came up with the rest, and I think she did a pretty fantastic job. We went back and forth with several different versions, and I finally picked this one. And I'm working with her on the next one too. She's great, so.
We were just talking about that today. The booksellers were like, "It's such a great cover."
I know, it's awesome, isn't it?
Yes.
I have no visual art skills at all, so I can't take credit for it.
If Iron and Fire was made into a movie, who would you envision to play Verity? Have you even thought about that?
I have. They're too old now, unfortunately, but I was watching the last season of Game of Thrones, and Kit Harington is just lovely. So I pictured him for Kit, and then if I'm gonna picture him, I love Amelia Clark.
Yeah.
So, but now they're, I think, too old to play early 20s, but that's who I picture when I'm thinking about them. Because who doesn't want to picture Kit Harington all the time?
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was so great.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you want to have books signed, does everyone want to have books signed? Okay, so I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm going to do this side of the room here. You can just stand up and create a line. She's going to be right over here, so you can just come right over here, out to the end, and just line up right here.